In my previous life, my father and I saved a girl on the train who had been forced into a situation, but she turned around and accused my father of harassing her. After a police investigation, my father was subjected to online abuse and forced to resign, while my mother was driven to leave behind a letter before disappearing. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself back on the day she was being bullied. This time, I grabbed my father, stopping him from stepping forward. This time, I watched helplessly as she was dragged into the abyss. The train jolted, that familiar, bone-deep sway. I snapped my eyes open. Above me was the dusty overhead luggage rack, packed with gunny sacks and suitcases. The clatter of wheels over the tracks echoed in my ears, and the air was thick with the smell of instant noodles, sweat, and the faint stench of cheap tobacco from some corner. I'd ridden this train before. More precisely, I'd ridden it in my last life. I slowly sat up, my palms pressing against the edge of the hard seat bench. The rough texture of the fabric felt real, too real to be a dream. Across from me was my father, wearing that faded dark blue police jacket, sleeves rolled up to his forearms, looking down at his phone. On the screen was a news alert, the timestamp reading, July 14, 2019, 3:21 p.m., July 14. My heart clenched sharply. It was this afternoon. This K-series train returning from the provincial capital to our hometown. Everything in my past life had begun to collapse. From this train, this moment. What's wrong? My dad looked up, probably noticing something was off with my expression. His eyebrows were thick, with a deep vertical wrinkle between them from years of frowning, giving him a stern look, yet his eyes always softened when he looked at me. That same gaze. This was the last time I saw it in my previous life. On a TV news report, he was surrounded by reporters at the entrance of his workplace, the flashbulbs turning his face deathly pale. He looked through the cameras, and the light in his eyes had gone out completely. I opened my mouth, but my throat felt like it was being choked. I wanted to say, let's change carriages, or, no matter what happens later, don't get involved, or, please, just this once, don't meddle in anything, but I said nothing, because I knew who I was dealing with. He had worked in the police station for 22 years, rising from a neighborhood officer to deputy chief, never taking a single cigarette from anyone, never bending the law for personal gain. The thing he was proudest of in his life was his police uniform. In my last life, my mother once told me a story. When my dad first became a cop, he once took a long-distance bus home during a vacation. A thief was stealing from passengers, and he, dressed in civilian clothes, jumped in and tackled 3 men alone, refusing to let go even when 2 ribs were broken. He was 25 then. Not even a formal officer, not even officially employed. That was the kind of man he was. So I knew, when he saw a girl being dragged by several men toward the carriage connection, he would stand up. He would, even if I told him the outcome in advance, he would still stand up. This man's bones were too hard, too rigid to bend, even if it meant being crushed himself. But I couldn't let him be crushed again. Nothing. I smiled at him, the smile a little stiff, just woke up a bit jolted. He glanced at me twice, didn't press further, and reached into the plastic bag on the table, pulling out a bottle of mineral water and handing it to me, already loosened. He had unscrewed it once. He was like that, meticulous in details, not at all like a rough man, but deep down, he had a kind of almost naive trust, believing justice was in people's hearts, believing the world wouldn't treat good people unfairly. In my last life, the world gave him a loud slap in the face. I unscrewed the cap, took a sip, and the cool water slid down my throat, jolting me fully awake. This wasn't a dream. It was real. I was back to before everything happened, back to that afternoon when I still had a chance to change everything. The carriage announcement sounded, the female announcer's voice slightly distorted by static, informing us that the next stop was 12 minutes away. My dad put away his phone, took out a pair of reading glasses from his pocket, and began flipping through a legal journal he had brought with him. He read intently, his finger tracing the lines slowly, occasionally furrowing his brow. I watched him, my fingers unconsciously tightening around the water bottle. Outside the window, fields rushed backward, the July sunlight glaring white across the land, while distant villages and woods blurred in the heat haze. Everything looked so calm, so normal, but I knew that in just a few minutes, something would happen in this carriage, something so small, so insignificant that at the time, I saw it as just another ordinary act of bravery, the kind I'd done countless times in my life, and yet, this one thing would drag our family into an abyss. Mom stewed pork ribs at home, I said without looking up. You can eat as soon as you get home. My nose suddenly stung, and I almost couldn't hold back. The last image of my mother in my previous life was what I saw through the crack in the bedroom door. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching a piece of paper in her hand. The expression on her face wasn't crying, it was empty, like a well that had been drained of water, leaving only dry soil and cracks. I later saw that letter, which began with, "Old Lynn, I'm sorry." What was she sorry for? She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just an ordinary middle-aged woman whose husband was slandered, cursed by the entire internet, suspended from work, whose home phone was bombarded with calls, and who was pointed at on the street. She couldn't bear it anymore. But what did she do wrong? The mistake was that we saved someone we shouldn't have. The mistake was that this world makes good people bleed and shed tears. The mistake was mine. I pulled that girl back from the abyss, but she turned around and pushed my father into another one. Spare ribs, I grunted, my voice a bit hoarse. My dad looked up at me again, this time holding his gaze for 2 seconds longer, but still didn't ask anything. That's just how he is. Never one for many words. When I was a kid and argued with him, slamming the door and locking myself in my room, he would just sit in the living room and wait. By the time I came out, dinner would already be on the table. He wouldn't lecture me, just glance at me and say, "Eat." That look in his eyes said everything, but he never voiced it. I always felt that behind his silence was a mountain, until my past life, when that mountain was pried apart and shattered piece by piece, and I realized that even mountains can fall. The carriage door was pushed open. My father and I looked up almost simultaneously. It wasn't just one person who entered, it was several. Leading the way was a middle-aged man in a floral shirt, his hair slicked back with a sheen, a smile plastered on his face, but it looked painted on, with the corners of his mouth perfectly upturned while his eyes remained motionless. Behind him followed 2 younger men, one tall and thin, the other short and stocky. The 3 of them fanned out in a triangular formation, showing no intention of sitting down, and headed straight for the middle of the carriage. In the middle of the carriage, 4 rows away from us by the window, sat a girl. She looked about 18 or 19, wearing a white short-sleeved t-shirt and jeans, with her hair tied in a ponytail. Earphones were plugged into her ears as she dozed against the window, a pink backpack resting beside her. Clearly a student. In my previous life, I noticed this girl because the man in the floral shirt reached out to lift her bangs. Now I know it wasn't about lifting her bangs. It was about confirming the target. My dad's legal journal turned to the next page, and he still hadn't noticed, but I had already seen it. The man in the floral shirt had taken a seat in front of the girl and turned sideways. From where I was, I could see his mouth moving, saying something to her. The girl woke up, first looking confused, then shaking her head and waving her hands, her expression shifting from bewilderment to tension. The man in the floral shirt showed no signs of stopping. Instead, he smiled even wider, leaning forward until his face was almost in front of hers. The tall, thin man behind him had somehow already positioned himself on the other side of the aisle, blocking the girl's way out. The short, stocky man stood a bit farther away, arms crossed, as if admiring the scenery. In reality, he was blocking the other direction too, a classic, hunting formation, a setup I hadn't understood in my previous life, only piecing it together later through repeated recollections of that scene. The man in the floral shirt was responsible for approaching and testing the waters, the tall, thin man for blocking the path, and the short, stocky man for keeping watch. The 3 of them worked seamlessly together. Clearly not their first time doing this, but in my previous life, I hadn't noticed any of this. All I saw was a girl being harassed by a stranger. My dad stood up and walked over. I followed. Then we saved the girl. And then she claimed my dad had touched her first. I don't remember when the man in the floral shirt slipped away. I don't remember when the tall, thin man and the short, stocky man turned into bystanders. All I remember is the girl crouching on the floor, crying, surrounded by a circle of people holding up their phones to record. She pointed at my dad, screaming hoarsely. It was him. He took advantage of the chaos to touch me. I kept saying no, but he still reached out. The carriage erupted. My dad stood in the middle of the crowd, his face wearing a kind of confusion I had never seen before. His hand was still frozen in the gesture of pushing the man in the floral shirt away, hanging in midair as if he hadn't had time to pull it back. Some people started shouting insults, others began recording videos. My dad tried to explain, but his voice was completely drowned out by the surrounding noise. I stood right beside him, utterly stunned. I had seen with my own eyes my dad walking over and pulling the man in the floral shirt away. I had seen him, my dad, shield the girl behind him. I had seen him flash his police badge at the three men and say, "I'm a police officer," from start to finish. His hands were always where I could see them. He hadn't even touched the hem of the girl's clothes, but what I said didn't matter because the girl's tears were too convincing. She crouched on the floor, curling into a ball, her shoulders shaking violently, her ponytail half undone. She looked exactly like a girl who had just been harassed. The bystanders didn't know my dad. They didn't know he was a kind-hearted man who had been a police officer for 22 years. All they saw was a man being accused of harassment by a girl, and that girl was crying as if her heart were breaking. In moments like these, whoever cries the hardest, whoever looks the most vulnerable, seems more like the victim. Everything that happened afterwards is etched into my mind as clearly as if carved with a knife. Someone in the carriage posted the video online with the title, "Police Officer Molests Girl on Train." The girl's face in the video was blurred, but my father's face was fully exposed for all to see. His police ID was also captured, with his unit, name, and badge number clearly visible. The video went viral that very night. Before my father even made it home, his phone started ringing, calls from relatives, colleagues, the media, and one unfamiliar number after another. Every call was met with a barrage of curses. My mother was frantic at home, her hands trembling as she tried to call my father. The next day, my father went to his unit to explain the situation. He believed that the innocent need not defend themselves, thinking the organization would investigate and clear things up. An investigation was indeed conducted, but public opinion didn't wait. Within just 48 hours, the video had over 20 million views, and the comments section was filled with words from people who seemed ready to tear him apart. Someone dug up our home address, and others called my mother, telling her to keep her pervert husband in check. My father was suspended from his unit pending the investigation. The investigation lasted a full 2 months. The girl later changed her story once, saying she might have misremembered, but she quickly reverted to her original statement, insisting my father had touched her. The three men in floral shirts seemed to have vanished into thin air, never to be seen again. 2 months later, the investigation concluded with insufficient evidence, no determination made, but my father could never go back. His photo was plastered all over the internet, and the words, "Police Officer Molestation," were now permanently attached to him, more firmly than any investigation conclusion. His unit, unable to withstand the pressure, advised him to resign. He signed the papers, folded his police uniform neatly, handed it back, and returned home without saying a word. He never wore that dark blue jacket again. 3 months later, my mother left a note and swallowed an entire bottle of sleeping pills. Thankfully, I came home early that day, thankfully, but when she woke up in the ICU, her eyes were empty, as if blaming me for saving her, and me. I was in my second year of university at the time. I took a leave of absence to stay home and watch over my mother. I hated that girl so much I couldn't sleep at night, tearing her apart in my mind countless times. But I hated myself even more, because on that train, I was the one who stood up first. I said to my father, "It looks like someone's being bullied over there." I was the one who pushed him into the worst nightmare of his life. In the carriage, the man in the floral shirt had already placed his hand on the back of the girl's seat. My father's legal journal was still open to that page, and he hadn't noticed yet, but I saw it. I saw the man in the floral shirt leaning toward the girl, saw the smile on his face shift from painted on to real, the kind of smile that comes from deep within when a predator sees its prey trapped. The girl was fully awake now. She took off her headphones, shrinking toward the window, her lips trembling. She began scanning the carriage with her eyes, searching for someone who could help her. Her gaze swept past my face, and at that moment, our eyes met. In my past life, that look made my father and me stand up. In this life, I grabbed my father's wrist tightly. My voice was soft and cold. "Don't look over there, don't get involved." My dad froze. His wrist was in my palm, and I could feel his pulse beating, fast and frantic. He had already seen it. The laughter from the floral shirt came from the middle of the carriage, not too loud, just enough for us to hear. The girl started shouting, her voice soft, trembling with tears. She said, "Get away from me," over and over, each time shakier than the last. My dad's body tensed. This was the reaction I knew best. Over 20 years of muscle memory, faster than his brain. His hand began to pull away from my grip, not with great force, but with determination. "Let go," he whispered, his brow furrowed. "Over there, I know better than you what's happening over there." I tightened my grip, my fingertips almost digging into the skin of his wrist. I know better than you. That floral shirt, that tall skinny guy, that short stocky one, the three of them are in it together. They didn't just decide this on a whim. They're hunting." My dad paused. He looked at me, and something shifted in his eyes, as if he were seeing his daughter anew. "Sit down," I said, my voice still quiet, but even I could hear the edge in it. "This time, listen to me, don't get involved. Don't anyone get involved." The girl's scream pierced the air, not a cry for help, but a shriek of pain. Finally, someone in the carriage stood up, a young man with glasses, who looked like a college student. He hesitated, took 2 steps toward the girl, and said, "What are you doing?" The floral shirt glanced back at him, and the tall skinny guy stepped directly in front of him. Standing there silently, the college student stopped, his lips moving, then retreated. "Officer, over there." A middle-aged woman sitting diagonally across from us looked urgently at my dad. She must have caught a glimpse of his police badge inside his jacket. "Please go check on that girl." I stood up abruptly, but I was faster than him. I used all my strength to push him back into his seat, pressing down on his shoulders with both hands, my whole body blocking his way. People in the carriage looked over, their expressions varied as they watched me restraining my dad. His face was pale with anger. He had never been treated like this by me before. His lips trembled as he whispered through gritted teeth, "Get out of my way." "No." I stood in front of him, my legs shaking, but my voice steady. "If you go over there now, in 3 months, Mom will die." He froze. "What did you say?" "If you save that girl today, 3 months from now, my mom will leave a letter and swallow a whole bottle of sleeping pills. You'll be cursed online, suspended from your job, forced to resign. Our family will fall apart. You and I will both die." I stared into his eyes, enunciating each word clearly. "I've lived through it once already, in this life. I don't plan to go through it again." The noise in the train car seemed to fade away at that moment. My dad looked at me, his mouth slightly agape, the vertical lines between his brows carved as deep as knife marks. He wanted to speak but couldn't. He probably thought I'd gone mad. In his eyes, I saw myself. I wasn't mad, I was clearer-headed than ever. In my past life, I was 19 years old. When I saw bad people bullying good people, my blood would boil, and I'd rush forward without a second thought, believing justice was the simplest thing in the world. Now I'm 20. No, counting the year from my past life, my actual mental age should be older. I've come to understand, justice is the most expensive thing in the world, so costly that even my dad's lifetime of accumulated dignity couldn't pay for it. The commotion around the floral shirt man had quieted down at some point. I tilted my head and peered through the gap between the seats. I could only see the girl being dragged toward the connecting area of the train car, flanked by the tall, thin man and the floral shirt man. Her hands flailed in the air, grabbing onto a seatback, but the tall, thin man pried her fingers off one by one. Her mouth was muffled by the floral shirt man's hand, leaving only stifled whimpers. The door to the connecting area was pulled open by the short, stout man. The restroom door was also open. Outside the train car, the endless July sunlight shone brilliantly over the cornfields lining the tracks, beautiful as a painting. The door closed. The girl's white t-shirt disappeared behind it. The train car fell silent for a few seconds. Then some people lowered their heads, others pretended to look at their phones, and a few whispered among themselves, but no one stood up again. The bespectacled college student sat with his head bowed, hands gripping his knees, shoulders trembling, whether from anger or fear, I couldn't tell. I looked at him as if looking at my past self. My father stopped struggling. He sat in his seat, hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed intently on the closed door of the carriage connection. He stared so hard that his eyes turned red. I slowly released my grip on his shoulders and sat back down in my seat. My fingers were trembling, my legs were shaking, and my back was drenched in sweat. That single moment had drained all the strength I had regained since my rebirth, but I had done it. In my previous life, my father had walked over and pushed that door open. In this life, I was the one who closed it. The carriage announcement sounded again, still that distorted female voice, announcing that the next stop was 5 minutes away. Scattered houses began to appear outside the window, telegraph poles receding one after another as the train gradually slowed down. My father remained silent. His legal journal had fallen to the floor. The open page happened to be an article explaining the crime of false accusation and framing. He picked up the journal, folded it, and placed it in his pocket, his movements slow, as if every inch of muscle movement required repeated confirmation from his brain. Then he turned to me. "What you said," he began, his voice low and hoarse, as if filled with shards of glass. Was that serious? I looked at him. Do you remember the case you handled last year, the elderly woman who was scammed out of 130,000 yuan in a telecom fraud? You spent 3 months tracking down the money and recovering it. On the day the case was closed, she gave you a banner, red with gold trim, inscribed with, "The People's Good Police Officer." I spoke slowly, each word seeming to be dredged up from the depths of memory. That banner now hangs on the left wall of your office, and on the right is a photo of you and Director Zhang. My father's pupils contracted. That banner had only been presented last month. His voice changed. How do you know? Because I've already lived through it once. I interrupted him. This is the second time. Last time, you were in this exact spot and saw that girl being harassed. You stood up and walked over, and then everything was ruined. You saved her life, and she turned around and accused you of harassing her, online. They called you a disgrace to the police force. The department advised you to resign. Mom left a letter. I've been through it all once before, so today, I glanced sideways at the carriage connection door, which remained closed. I chose not to save her. As I said these words, my heart felt as if it had been pierced by something, but the feeling quickly passed. That small sting was nothing compared to the look in my mother's eyes when she opened them and looked at me in the ICU. In this life, my father fell silent. He stayed silent for so long that the train began to slow down and pull into the station, long enough for the platform's awning and pillars to appear outside the window. The door at the carriage connection creaked open a crack. First the man in the floral shirt stepped out, followed by the tall, thin one, then the short, stocky one. The three of them adjusted their clothes, walking through the carriage in the opposite direction as if nothing had happened. They didn't look at anyone, their faces as expressionless as if they'd just come from the toilet. The girl didn't come out. My father stared at the direction the three had left, his fists slowly clenching. His hands were covered in calluses and scars. The hands that had gripped countless criminals, now could only grip tightly onto his knees, his knuckles turning white. What about that girl? What do we do? He asked. It was the last thing he said on the train. I said something I could never have said in my previous life. She chose it herself. In the last life, she chose to repay kindness with betrayal. In this life, let her bear the consequences of her own choice. The train came to a stop, the doors opened, and a wave of July heat rushed into the carriage, carrying the scorched smell of sun-baked rails and the faint scent of locust blossoms drifting from somewhere in the distance. I stood up, grabbed my bag from the overhead rack, and glanced back at my father, still sitting there, unchanged in posture. Sunlight slanted through the window, illuminating his graying temples, casting half his face in light. I noticed his temples were much whiter than I remembered. During the final year of my previous life, his hair had been completely white. Let's go, I said, reaching out to support his arm. Mom's stewing ribs at home, waiting for us. He slowly stood up, picked up his bag, and patted the non-existent dust off his knees, a gesture so familiar. After he quit his job and returned home in the last life, he would sit on the balcony every day, repeatedly performing this motion. Though there was nothing on his knees, he kept patting them. As we exited the station, he walked half a step ahead of me. His back was slightly hunched, his shoulders drooping, his police jacket flapping backward in the wind. I looked at his back, and suddenly a thought surged up inside me, one that made every hair on my body stand on end. That girl had known us in the last life. When she turned on us, she shouted, "Police officer, you're harassing me." My father was in plain clothes, wearing a shirt under his jacket, with no police badge visible. He never showed his officer's ID to that girl at any point. He only showed it to the three men in floral shirts, but the girl called him police officer directly. How did she know he was a cop, unless she had been watching us since the moment we boarded the train? People were coming and going on the platform. I watched my father's back grow farther and farther away, while images from my past and present lives wildly intertwined in my mind. In my previous life, I was only consumed by hatred for that girl, only by resentment toward the world, never thinking about this question: how did she know he was a cop, unless she had been targeting my father from the very beginning? I clenched the bag in my hand, my nails digging into my palm, the pain bringing me back to my senses. The pain kept me sober. In my last life, our family was destroyed completely, and I harbored hatred for a whole year, branded with the words repaying kindness with betrayal. But if that girl had been prepared from the very beginning, then this wasn't just about a ingrate. Someone had set a trap, and my father and I had walked right into it in our last life. shattered to pieces. Without even knowing who had set the trap, the heat on the platform rose in waves, making my eyes sting. I quickened my steps to catch up with my dad, taking a bag from his hand. Once we get home, there's something I need to tell you. He glanced at me sideways, the vertical lines on his brow deepening, but he didn't say, "You're crazy." Instead, he gave a slight nod. It was barely noticeable, but I saw it. It was already dusk when I got home. My mom had indeed stewed pork ribs. The pressure valve of the pressure cooker was hissing in the kitchen, and the whole house was filled with the aroma of braised ribs and rice. She was wearing that floral apron she'd worn for at least 10 years. Poking her head out from the kitchen, her face lit up with a smile, her eyes sparkling, completely different from the hollow, numb look I last remembered. "You're back. Did the train get delayed?" She wiped her hands and came over, taking the bag from my hand. "You didn't eat anything on the train again, did you? I always said you'd get hungry on the train because you hate the food." My dad changed into slippers, gave a soft and walked straight into the living room, sitting down on the sofa, his back still slightly hunched, shoulders slumped, exactly as he'd been since he quit his job. I looked at him, and my heart sank. What happened on the train today had hit him too hard. He wasn't the kind of person who could ignore a cry for help. 20 years as a police officer had welded the words, "nerve," and "step forward," together. Today, forcing him to stay seated was like uprooting his very instinct. My mom didn't notice anything unusual. Still chattering about buying vegetables in the afternoon, I went to the kitchen to help set the tableware. And while she turned to serve rice, I glanced through the kitchen door into the living room. My dad was sitting on the sofa, the TV off, phone untouched, just sitting there, hands resting on his knees, palms down, as if pressing down on something invisible. That posture was so familiar to me. After he quit his job, every afternoon he'd sit like that on the balcony for hours, until it was completely dark before getting up. "What's wrong with your dad?" my mom asked in a low voice as she walked past me carrying a bowl of pork rib soup. "He doesn't seem right, probably tired, didn't sleep well on the train," I mumbled in response. Dinner was quiet. The pork rib soup was delicious. My mom's cooking has always been good, but my dad only took 2 sips of the soup and a few bites of vegetables before putting down his bowl. My mom looked at him, then at me, hesitating several times as if wanting to say something, but in the end, she said nothing and got up to go to the kitchen to cut the watermelon. When she brought the watermelon to the table, my dad finally spoke. "On the train today," his voice was flat, as if he were reporting for work. "Everything you said to me, from start to finish, tell me again." My mom's watermelon knife paused, the blade hovered over the bright green rind, and the light caught the edge, reflecting a cold glint. I put down my chopsticks and took a deep breath. "I'll start from the beginning. After you hear it all, you can decide whether to believe me or not." I told them everything, from the moment we met that girl on the train, to my dad stepping forward to help her, to the girl turning around and accusing him, to the video being posted online, to the overwhelming public backlash, to my dad being suspended, investigated, and forced to resign, to my mom, I glanced at her, to my mom leaving a letter and taking pills, to me dropping out of school to stay home and watch over them, to the girl later retracting her statement and then taking it back, to the 3 men in floral shirts who never showed up again. I said it all in one breath, without pausing for a single word. The living room was as quiet as a well. The cicadas outside the windows suddenly grew loud, their chirping washing over us in waves. My mom set the watermelon knife down on the cutting board. Her lips were trembling. She didn't cry, but her eyes were red, as if something had burned them from the inside. She looked at me, then at my dad, her lips moving several times before she managed to squeeze out a sentence. "What you said, is it true?" "It's true," I said, looking into her eyes. "In my past life, I was 19, I didn't understand anything, I couldn't do anything, I could only watch as this family was torn apart. This life is different." Today on the train, I stopped my dad. "I didn't save that girl. No matter what happens next, at least today our family didn't fall into that trap." My father didn't interrupt me from start to finish. He sat bolt upright, his hands still resting on his knees, but no longer in a posture of holding something down. Instead, they were clenched into fists. His eyes were also red, but he didn't let the tears fall. This man's tear ducts had probably long been worn out over more than 20 years of police work. "You said," his voice was hoarse, "that girl called me Uncle Policeman, but I only showed my badge to the 3 men in floral shirts. How did she know my identity, right?" I nodded. "This is what I've never been able to figure out. in my past life, I was too consumed by hatred to ever think about this question, but today on the platform, it suddenly dawned on me, she had been watching us from the moment she boarded the train. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, it was planned. The three men in floral shirts were responsible for acting, and she was responsible for being bullied. And you, I looked at him, enunciating each word clearly, you were their target.